She dressed in red to die. Not blood red, not theatrical red, a deep, deliberate crimson, the liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom, chosen hours before the axe fell, chosen while her hands were still steady. That is the detail that stops you cold. Not that she was about to be executed, not that she had spent 19 years in an English prison, but that in her final hours, while most people would be bargaining or weeping or both, Mary, Queen of Scots, was curating. She knew exactly what she was doing. She always had. And somehow, that's what makes the whole catastrophic arc of her life so hard to look away from. Because this was a woman of staggering intelligence, devastating charm, and the kind of political instincts that should have made her untouchable, who still managed, through a series of decisions so catastrophically bad they read like fiction, to destroy every throne she ever sat on. She sat on 2 of them, by the way, at the same time. That's where this story starts. Before we move further, if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the video. December 1542, Scotland. A king dies at 30 years old, and the crown of an entire nation passes immediately to his only surviving legitimate child, a girl, 6 days old. 6 days. She hasn't learned to focus her eyes yet, and she is already a queen. That is the first thing you need to understand about Mary Stuart. She was not born into power. She was swamped by it before she could breathe. Scotland scrambles into regency politics. The vultures gather. And Mary's mother, the formidable French noblewoman Mary of Guise, makes the calculation that saves her daughter's life and plants the seeds of everything that follows. She gets the child out of Scotland entirely. 5 years old, sent to France. Not as a refugee, as a prize. Here's the part that doesn't make it into the basic history lesson. Mary Stuart wasn't just sent to France for safety. She was sent to France because a deal had been struck, a marriage deal, binding a 5-year-old girl to the 4-year-old heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Francis. 2 children, neither of them old enough to understand what was being promised on their behalf, already locked into a geopolitical arrangement that would shape the next century. But here's the twist that makes the whole thing stranger. It worked. They actually liked each other. Mary grew up in the French court and thrived in a way she never would again. She was brilliant at languages: French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, Greek. She could ride, hunt, write poetry. She was, by most contemporary accounts, extraordinarily charismatic and almost absurdly beautiful. Nearly 6 feet tall, in an era when that was remarkable for a man, let alone a woman. The French court adored her. The Dauphin adored her. They married in 1558. She was 15, he was 14. And then, 1 year later, his father died. Suddenly, Francis was King of France, which meant Mary was Queen of France, and still Queen of Scotland, simultaneously. At 16 years old, she held 2 crowns at once, and through her grandmother's Tudor bloodline, she had a claim to a third. That's not a life. That's a target. England's Protestant queen, Elizabeth I, looked at this 16-year-old Catholic girl wearing 2 crowns with a claim on a third and did not see a charming teenager. She saw an existential threat. Many English Catholics considered Elizabeth illegitimate, the daughter of Henry VIII's controversial second marriage, the product of a union the Church had never fully recognized. In that worldview, the rightful Queen of England wasn't Elizabeth at all. It was Mary. Mary's French father-in-law, King Henry II, had already been quietly floating this idea. Quietly is generous. He'd had Mary's coat of arms updated to include the English royal arms, which was about as subtle as a cannon pointed at Windsor Castle. Elizabeth noticed. She never forgot it. The tension between these 2 women, who never once met in person, who conducted their entire rivalry through letters and intermediaries and spies, would define the next 30 years of British history. And it would end, as these things so often do, in blood. But first, the fall. Francis II died in December 1560. Ear infection. He was 17. Mary was 18, a widow, and suddenly surplus to requirements in a French court now controlled by her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, who had never particularly liked her. She had to go back to Scotland. This was not a triumphant return. This was a woman who had been French for most of her life, who thought in French, dreamed in French, whose first language was French, washing up on the shore of a country that had spent the intervening years throwing off Catholicism and lurching toward hardline Protestantism. A country where the preacher John Knox was publicly calling female rule an offense against God. A country where her own half-brother, the Earl of Moray, was waiting to use her. She was 20 years old. She was alone, and she had not been home since she was 5. She should have been cautious. She was not cautious. 4 years after her return, Mary did something that managed to alienate virtually every powerful person in Europe simultaneously. She fell in love. Lord Darnley. Tall, handsome, vain, and deeply, catastrophically stupid. He was her cousin, a Tudor on his mother's side, which made him attractive as a political match for the English succession. But the attraction wasn't political, not entirely. Mary wanted him. She chose him, against the advice of her council, against the quiet fury of Elizabeth, who saw 2 Tudor claimants joining their bloodlines and went pale, against the wishes of her half-brother Moray, who immediately launched a rebellion. She married Darnley in 1565 anyway. Within months, she regretted it. He was weak where she needed strength, jealous where she needed loyalty, and drunk where she needed a partner. She gave him titles and withheld real power, which he responded to by becoming a liability. And then, in March 1566, he became something worse. Mary was 6 months pregnant. She was in her private supper room at Holyrood Palace with a small group of companions, including her secretary, David Rizzio, an Italian musician who had become her closest confidant. Darnley walked in with a group of armed conspirators, pinned Mary to her chair, and had Rizzio dragged out of the room. They stabbed him 56 times, in front of the pregnant queen. The marriage was, at that point, effectively over. Their son James was born 3 months later. Mary reportedly told Darnley, looking at the infant, "He is so much your son that I fear it will be worse for him." She had already stopped pretending. But here's the detail that historians still argue about. Darnley didn't survive long enough for the divorce. In February 1567, the house where he was sleeping, recovering from what was described as syphilis, was destroyed in an explosion in the middle of the night. His body was found in the garden. He hadn't been killed by the blast. He'd been strangled. The Earl of Bothwell was the prime suspect. Everyone knew it. There was essentially no doubt. And Mary, who almost certainly knew more about what had happened than she ever admitted, responded to this political firestorm by doing the single most self-destructive thing available to her. She married Bothwell 3 months later. 3 months. The man accused of murdering her husband. The details of how that marriage came about are still debated. Some contemporary accounts describe Bothwell abducting Mary, taking her to Dunbar Castle and assaulting her, with the marriage staged as a face-saving cover. Others argue she collaborated in her own abduction, that she wanted Bothwell, that the staged kidnapping was the only way to marry the prime suspect in her husband's murder without appearing entirely complicit. Either version is horrifying. One is a crime done to her. The other is a calculation so reckless it defies belief. The Scottish nobility chose not to parse the distinction. They raised an army. What followed happened with brutal speed. Mary's forces dissolved. Bothwell fled. He would die insane in a Danish prison 11 years later, allegedly chained to a post in his own filth. Mary was captured, paraded through Edinburgh while crowds screamed that she was a whore and a murderess. She was imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle. She miscarried twins in captivity, and then she was forced to abdicate. Her son, 13 months old, was crowned James VI of Scotland. Mary's half-brother Moray, who had betrayed her once before, became regent. She escaped, brilliantly actually, through a plan involving a young boy named Willie Douglas, a May Day celebration, and getting the entire castle population drunk, gathered an army, lost the battle, and crossed into England in a fishing boat on 16 May 1568. She was 25 years old. She had been Queen of France. She had been Queen of Scotland. She had lost both crowns. And she crossed into England, believing that her cousin Elizabeth would help her. Elizabeth did not help her. She couldn't. Mary, alive on English soil, free, Catholic, and with a claim to the English throne, was a walking spark in a country already soaked in religious tension. What Elizabeth did instead was keep Mary in a kind of indefinite limbo, imprisoned but comfortably. Not a prisoner, officially, not free, just contained, for 19 years. The castles changed, the handlers changed, the seasons changed, and the world outside moved on, and Mary Stuart, who had been a queen at 6 days old, stayed in her rooms and wrote letters and plotted and waited. And that was her real mistake. Not the marriages, not Bothwell. The mistake was the plotting, because Elizabeth had a spy master, Francis Walsingham. The man is worth his own documentary. He built the Elizabethan intelligence network more or less from scratch, and he was watching Mary with the focused patience of someone who already knew how the story ended. In 1586, he allowed the Babington Plot, a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, to develop long enough for Mary to endorse it in writing. Some historians believe Walsingham's agents manipulated the correspondence, that the cipher letters passed to Mary were doctored, that Mary's reply was intercepted, altered, used against her. None of that ultimately mattered. She had approved the plot. In writing. It was enough. The trial lasted 2 days. Mary was denied legal counsel, denied access to her own papers, denied her Catholic confessor. She argued, correctly as a matter of technical legal logic, that as an anointed foreign queen, she was not an English subject and could not be convicted of treason against an English crown. She was convicted anyway. Elizabeth hesitated to sign the death warrant for months, fully aware of what it meant to execute an anointed queen, that it shattered a kind of political sacred barrier that, once broken, could never be repaired. Her own Privy Council, impatient, finally processed the warrant without waiting for direct orders. On the night of February 7, 1587, Mary was told she would die the next morning. She spent the night in prayer. She distributed her belongings to her household. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she wrote her final letter to Henry III of France, her former brother-in-law, and in it she said, "I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning." And then, beneath that sentence, a declaration. She died not for any crime, but for her Catholic faith and her rightful claim to the English crown. She signed it, "Your very loving and most true sister, Mary R." She dressed in red. The axe fell 3 times. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second severed it, mostly. The executioner finished with a sawing motion. He held her head up, declared, "God save the Queen," and the auburn hair in his fist turned out to be a wig. Her actual hair, beneath it, was cropped close and almost entirely white. She had been gray for years. She had been wearing that wig, that performance of the young queen she had once been, right up until the end. Her little dog, which had been hiding beneath her skirts through the entire execution, crept out and lay down between her head and her body and refused to move. Even that detail she could not have scripted better. 19 years after her death, her son James, the infant she had left behind, the boy who had calmly accepted the news of her execution without visible distress, who had not raised a single serious protest, became King of England when Elizabeth died childless. He had her reinterred in Westminster Abbey, in a chapel directly opposite Elizabeth's tomb. The two women who never met, who circled each other for decades across the length of England, who each represented a version of what a queen could be in that brutal century, they ended up spending eternity across the aisle from each other. Mary, Queen of Scots, had claimed the English throne her entire life. She never sat on it. Her son got it instead, and he put her where she'd always believed she belonged, inside the walls of the palace she was never allowed to enter alive.